that there's huge opportunity around using the data sets that we can assemble to expose fewer patients to harmful or ineffective doses of drug in the clinical trial process. And I would go further and say that if we really look at some of the mathematical opportunities that we have when we're looking at these very large data sets, we should be able to also do a better job of ultimately matching the perfect patient, and maybe consumer as well, but certainly somebody once they have a certain diagnosis with a more optimal drug, a more optimal dosage than they might have had in our current models. So I really see this idea of using big data in the world of life sciences as a way to optimize the average therapeutic value, which also means the, therefore, average commercial value of the drugs that life sciences companies are bringing to market, and that's pretty exciting.
I'm Colin Hill. I'm the CEO and co-founder of GNS Healthcare. So we're one of the early big data analytics companies in healthcare, not just serving the biopharma world, but also payers and providers. Our focus is, and this will build upon what you just heard my two colleagues say, our focus is better matching healthcare interventions to patients in order to improve outcomes and lower costs. And drugs are a very important set of interventions that we have in our artillery. But we believe that the opportunity really goes beyond just the aggregation of data, but really on also the crunching of the data to identify those optimal interventions in a comparative effectiveness type setting, but also in an R&D setting where one can aggregate large quantities of clinical trial data to start to predict ahead of time which drugs are going to work in which subpopulations early on. And this is becoming increasingly important as cost pressures on healthcare interventions across the board, including drugs, become more and more real, especially in the world of specialty care.
Hi, I'm Dick Kingham. I'm a partner with Covington and Burling. I'm a regulatory lawyer. I've got about 40 years of experience, including about 24 years in Europe as well as in the United States. My focus here today really is on what regulatory issues may be raised by the use of so-called big data to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of drugs, either in general or for specific subpopulations, which has already been adverted to. And there are some issues that will need to be resolved, and we'll talk a bit as we go through about what the obstacles are, but also what the opportunities are. We've been using big data in the regulatory sphere for many, many years to detect signals, to detect risks of drugs. The question now is how to use them affirmatively to make decisions about what we can claim for drugs and what instructions we can give in labeling for their use and treatment of specific patients.
Hi, I'm Perakslis with Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital, and most of my training, I'm actually a research scientist who's ended up doing a lot of data and a lot of IT. Been through, it was at J&J for 13 years, was at the FDA for a few years, and now at Harvard. And what I'm doing at Harvard and what I'm probably going to bring here is more of a closer to the patient view of translation. I got to do great drug discovery, development, both small and large molecule, my 15 years in biopharma. And now, of course, have the data at my disposal for 15 of the Harvard hospitals, and a lot of what really goes on with HIT, with electronic medical records, what's really going on in clinical care, how is decision making changing, and and then how do you bring in the cycle of medical product development into that? So I'm into that, very much focused right now also on rare diseases and patient-centered outcomes like the PCORI. We have several large PCORI groups we're working with and grants. And then the last thing is also, and somewhat from both my pharma and FDA, is I'm also very focused on cybersecurity. So how do you do big data and how do you keep people, products, and providers and manufacturers safe in an environment where we see what happened the last holidays where pretty much, everyone that went to Target might have gotten hacked type world. So it's a very exciting, we've got to do it well.
Great. Well, as you can tell, we have an extremely knowledgeable panel here, and we have a wonderful Tonight Show setup. So I might actually get up, given that I have a movable mic. But unlike the Tonight Show, we'll have a conversation with our distinguished panelists. We'll also have some time for Q&A and hopefully a discussion, bringing in some of you in the audience. And then we'll finish with the patented lightning round of quick questions, just to finish with a little bit of a bang. But just to get the conversation started, maybe I could return to you, Joel. We asserted before that, in fact, data has been used for many years in biopharma. But I'm interested in maybe your perspective, given your broad experience, in terms of, what's the cutting edge now? What are people doing currently using big data in the industry?
Yeah, I think, as we started to think from a project perspective, and just let me back up a little bit and I'll give you some history on this project. The Project Datasphere project is actually sponsored by the CEO Roundtable on Health, and a subset of that in the Life Science Consortium. And as we in the Life Science Consortium and the CEO Roundtable started thinking about what do we have at our disposal and what information are we collecting as an industry, and where is that information sitting right now? So there are, giga, tera, bigger bytes in the basements of various companies collecting dust generally. So we thought, as a company that had a lot of data, is what could we do with it, and how do we assemble those data into something that can be used more broadly and to give back to the patients, as I mentioned earlier. So I started at one company and then have recently moved to another and brought this project along with me. And the interesting fact is that there was a lot of very there's a lot of enthusiasm across the biopharmaceutical industry to reuse some data. And there are principles that are being put in place based on really transparency-related issues that are more about, making certain people know what the biopharma industry is doing. But this project is different than that, and Project Datasphere really is to focus on how can we use those data to make the next trial better. Just a few years ago, a group at Lilly had published kind of a productivity equation about how to improve clinical development. And it's a function of sort of your work in progress, your probability of success, the value that you bring, also the cost and the cycle time. So we thought, what if you could reduce the cycle time by reducing the number of patients in a particular clinical trial? And if you could do that by reducing the control arm, as my colleague said, is not to expose people that don't need to be exposed. So we did some back-of-the-envelope calculations and looked at sort of a phase 2 and 3 program. We came up with a lot of money that could be saved by just knocking 5% off a particular clinical trial. So not only can you improve the value of a clinical trial process, you can potentially reduce the number of patients that are in that comparator arm, and then also use that revenue saved to put back into the R&D system. So I think there's a lot of vision around this particular project, but I think very simply using those clinical trial data to optimize data standards, to do better epidemiologic studies. You could do teaching from it. A lot of medical institutions make up their own data sets. Now these are free and they're out there, and they're in a comparator, they're in a controlled setting. So lots and lots of potential opportunities. We haven't even scratched the surface yet, and one of the things that we like on this project is we don't know how good it can be. And we want people to analyze these data that perhaps might not be life scientists. And are there ways to examine trends in the data that typically don't see as life science companies?
Yeah. Terrific. So you've mentioned transparency. You've mentioned a number of different ways in which value is being created through big data. Other stories that people want to tell about what's happening already in the industry in terms of using data, which are interesting and perhaps informative as well.
I'll volunteer.
Please.
So there's a couple of efforts we have going on that I think represent some of the vanguard of what's happening in the industry. One started with a collaboration with Covington around now taking a large number of clinical trials, data across the board in those clinical trials, and now attempting to not just aggregate that data, but now turning that data using advanced artificial intelligence algorithms running on cloud-based supercomputers, turning that data into predictive computer models that can help to identify which parameters in the clinical trial design are going to be key in determining success or not. When we did this from preclinical to phase 1 to phase 2, all the way through registration to end up with a predictive platform for clinical trials. Now, this type of thing has been talked about for some years, but now we've finally seen it turn into reality. There'll hopefully be some public publication that comes out from this soon. That's one I think that really highlights the cutting edge of big data or big math applied in pharma R&D. Another...
Just if I might interrupt,
Yep.
What's new? Why is it that we're able to do this now? Because we have talked about these sorts
Right.
of optimizing the number of subjects in a trial. So
Yep.
why is it different now?
I think there's a couple things. I think one is we just didn't have the data before. When we started the company in 2000, right, there was a big tsunami of data. We were all drowning in data, supposedly, because of genomics. And the truth is, we weren't. There really wasn't that much data, certainly not integrated from genotype to phenotype in any real way. And of course, the computing power was rather clunky. We've been living through, quietly, decades of Moore's Law to give us more and more powerful computing at a lower cost. And I think it's one of these trends that still is, for the most part, lost on the pharma industry. But I think the biggest thing of why it's different is that people care a lot more now, in that the economic pressures to create more efficacious drugs that are more differentiated from other things, and I think the big net new that actually has caused the interest in big data across the board in biopharma, both R&D as well as commercial, has to do with cost pressures, has to do with now there's a need to not just get the drugs approved, but to prove that they have economic value in the marketplace over and above various other competing drugs. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's the biggest trend that makes this important now, and why even 3 or 4 years ago, you guys would have not had this panel here.
Can I add one comment here before my colleagues jump in here? But two other things too, Michael, that I see is the tools and the technology to analyze those data and open sources. I mean, I think that's a key factor. There are people looking at data that historically had been, biopharmaceutical companies or financial world, or, it's something that looking at trends, but now everyone is looking at how all of it works together and how it cross matches.
Got it. And so do you mean software that's open source software, or do you mean open data, which we've also studied as well?
Yeah, I think probably both.
Yeah.
I mean, and let me just use our project again, if I may, which I failed to mention, launched on Tuesday, so we're quite happy about that after several years of work. But there are certainly some open source. We've been working very closely with SAS, and SAS has offered up some of their analytics tools on our site for free. And so there are open source, really valuable tools. But I think the ability of people making their own tools, or using existing ones, but there's open data and open source tools to use it.
Yeah, terrific.
I think open source is interesting. It may have, in some ways, been a catalyst to start to get people to think about being more open about data over the last decade and a half. And probably in its infancy, but if you look at what organizations like Transcelerate are trying to do, all signs point to...
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so I assume everybody knows about it. Transcelerate came out of, I know that what I'm about to say is hyperbole, but I like to think of all these heads of R&D sitting in a basement of this castle in Scotland, smoking cigars and drinking brandy and kind of plotting about the world in a positive way. I think it's probably a little more casual than that. But there's this event that happens literally in a castle once a year, and coming out of it one year was this agreement to set up a not-for-profit organization to promote the sharing of information in a non-competitive way across pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies, and I think it's been a tremendous success story so far. And I think the formation of Transcelerate and the momentum that it has is, to me, an indicator that we are in this kind of new golden age of information sharing. And there just hasn't been a lot of organizational willingness, and certainly not the tools to do it. But that's definitely changing now.
Yeah. Eric, let's come to you. We've talked a little bit about what's happening already.
Sure.
But I asserted again that there's a huge amount of uncaptured potential yet for big data, and as
Sure.
applied to biopharma and healthcare more generally. Can you talk about what isn't happening yet that that potential is still there?
I think, most biopharma across the board, they're dabbling in at least a little bit of all of it. I think the pieces I'm not seeing, I don't see the mobility and virtualization taking hold the way we see it. I mean, we're in a culture where, a couple months, Apple's going to release a phone and people are going to stand in line for 3 days to get it. My daughter's 12, and her and her friends spend their Friday night doing PowerPoint slides and on media and stuff like that. I mean, people are thinking and consuming data differently, and it's changing the way they think, the way they consume, and in some case, people even say the way people's brains are working. And I think, and I think a lot of this is feeding into that. We're going up and looking at people think that data should be out there and should be open. A lot of the great work that's going on in a lot of the different groups right now that are doing GSK's, J&J's, Transcelerate, that are sharing. So I think that's there. But the ability to bring it home, I don't see that we've used it to virtualize trials as much as we probably could. If at Boston Children's, if I know this young lady in Fargo who I don't know is close enough to an academic medical center to get in a trial. I work with ASCO. Only 3% of cancer patients seen in this country end up in an RCT. So it means we're not systematically learning from 97% of the people that have cancer. So if you look at that and say with virtualization and things like that, the opportunity's there, right, to do this stuff, to make it. I mean, there's a very famous Norman Rockwell painting of a doctor looking through a TV at a child who knows when that was done, right? We don't have that. Yet we have all this other stuff. So I think mobility, virtualization are probably the largest things and the least expensive things, because go to what we call the developing world and look at what they do with the cheap cell phones. Look at the way they run, look at the way WHO does public health and things like that with the inexpensive cell phones that my daughter wouldn't take for free if I made her, right? But they make, so I mean, I think that we've gotten a little fancy with some of it. I think the opportunity is huge, and I do think mobility and virtualization are untapped.
Other panelists, in terms of things that, we can talk about, but for some reason aren't getting done right now.
Well, sure. I mean, one question is the degree to which data derived from sources other than the traditional randomized clinical trial are going to be usable for regulatory purposes, as usable to create the label directions for use for drugs, to identify specific patient subpopulations and so forth. I think there's a very good argument that we're headed toward a point where, at least in identifying subpopulations and targeting medicines to people, there's a huge contribution to be made from data sources and forms of analysis other than RCTs, but there's going to need to be a change in culture in the regulatory agencies to accept that. I think it could happen. I think, in fact, some of the basis for it exists already in law, but there's going to be a significant educational process there.
Talk more about what some of those sources are and what the barriers are to using them.
Well, the biggest barrier, of course, is the traditional assumption that randomized controlled clinical trials are mandatory, and of course in certain circumstances they are. They are to demonstrate effectiveness of drugs for the most part. They're legally mandatory in the US. They're not actually technically mandatory in Europe, but they are for practical purposes, with certain exceptions. But for demonstration of issues like safety, or for making determinations based upon large bodies of clinical data, but making finer determinations based upon them and so forth, for serving, for example, as the basis for concluding that a single controlled trial is sufficient to demonstrate effectiveness because you have data from other sources that corroborate it. Those are all things that I think are allowed under current law. Also, when we have major safety questions arise, we use big data to identify the safety questions. We're less willing to use big data to answer the safety questions. So there are lots of opportunities, I think, in those areas. We obviously have the area of pharmacoeconomics, health technology assessment, what NICE is doing in the UK and so forth. And there already they're using essentially any data that are available because they don't have RCTs for the most part. But we're going to have to decide over the long run what the gold standard is for making those determinations.
Can you talk a little more about the potential, what are the other potential sources of data which you could bring to bear with the traditional RCTs?
Obviously, first of all, there are health claims data. There's an enormous body of information simply about for example, if you're talking about new uses of an existing therapeutic entity, of an existing molecule, there may be an enormous base of data on how particular types of patients respond to that, which could be predictive of where there might be safety issues, which patients should be contraindicated, things like that. And today, those are largely used for purposes of identifying a problem to be answered, but not for answering the problem.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there are things that we could do in the future.
Yeah. Eric, if I could return to you, just coming back, what are the barriers, right? So you talked about mobility, for instance. Why aren't we doing that? It seems like, right, people are lining up.
I think we're dabbling in it, and people will get there. I think it's somewhat of a development curve and a realization curve, but I think some folks will move in very heavily. I mean, I think if you look at Health Map or things where they're doing digital disease detection and how long it used to get a food outbreak. I mean, when I went to FDA, I was amazed at how fast they knew it was the cantaloupe and where the cantaloupe was. and then realized they had sequenced pathogens from every state, and they could almost get it to the farm to say that, that type of ability to do that. I think it's there. I also think it's a little bit, though, what would you do with all the data sources? PCORI, for folks who know PCORI is the patient-centered. They've recently put just a fantastic amount of money into these patient clinical research networks. We're actually one of them, as well as several patient-powered networks. And it's interesting, because I think the idea is, how would you ever, I was at several IOM conferences this fall when we were tasked with figuring out how are we going to get data, especially to approach a regulatory level of credibility out of this. And it's like, well, one of my friends who was sitting there as a physician is, well, I was always told every day in medical school, remember to ask the patient how they're feeling. So I think it's a really important thing to remember to do, and capture that data and go. Is an adverse event that someone mentions on Facebook less data than someone filled out? We've done this, right? At Harvard, we've got the MedWatcher app versus MedWatch. It's a screen and an app versus 14 pages. And what we're seeing is the data is just as credible. So I think that's a real opportunity to use mobility. And the FDA has been pushing that. To their credit, they're pushing folks to use that more and do it. So I think it will grow. I mean, the app for that thing has good and bad, because on the diagnostic side and stuff, again, it gets into regulation, but you get into the fact that the apps that takes a picture of your mole and diagnose whether or not you have melanoma are probably not a good use of, or legal use of technology, right? So I think there's pros and cons to it.
And on virtualization, what will it take?
I think it's happening. I mean, if you go into trickier areas of medicine like neurology, you're seeing this all the time. A lot of folks, you have no idea where the radiologist that's reading your CAT scan is, because they could be near a pool anywhere on the planet doing it, right? So I think there's the other use case of that. But I guess when does the case report form become that? If you're talking about traditional metal product development, when is it just as valid? When can you really virtualize those trials? When can you move folks in and out and dare I say, truly get towards adaptation, get towards, being able to move the protocol a little bit as you're learning going through? I think those are the things you could physically enable with quality that way. But they're tougher steps.
Yeah. Other opportunities uncaptured, yeah.
Well, actually, I think it's interesting to talk about some of the cultural issues that Richard and Eric were identifying.
Yeah.
Right? So we're talking about big data in this session, but I think if you take a critical eye and you look at the way life science industries approach drug development, we're pretty bad at leveraging small data. And we should figure out those reasons and solve them before we get too big. And I think if you had a data scientist's definition of what big data was, you would have something that is petabytes of information that is very heterogeneous in nature and difficult to map. And actually, if you took the current clinical trial data sets, probably of every organization that's represented in this building, at most it's hundreds of terabytes, so it's not big enough to qualify, and it's actually pretty easily mapped. Maybe it requires some work because we don't have great data standards, but this is not rocket science to do. Why are we not doing it? And so I think we do need to look at why are we not doing more adaptive clinical trials? There are certain attitudes that we have around biostats where I think, mathematically, and I am a Bayesian, full disclosure, but there's obvious mathematical things that we could be doing to, squeeze 5, 10, 50% more value out of the clinical trials that we're running today. We're not running them. And one of the things that I would throw up there, I'm definitely a glasses half full, not empty person usually, but I think there is a cultural thing that we've got to fix. And certainly the pressures that we're seeing from a pricing perspective, from a commercial perspective, from a regulatory perspective, are creating a sense of urgency at the top of a lot of life sciences organizations in terms of looking at innovative ways to do things. And so big data is kind of the big shiny toy that everybody's talking about. Okay, that'll be the problem, the solution to all our problems. That urgency, at least in my experience, doesn't often translate down into the day-to-day work of the people who are planning programs, who are running studies. And so therefore, I don't think it should be that surprising that we're not doing more virtualization, we're not using more aggressive mathematical techniques when you get down to the brass tacks of somebody who's been assigned to get this compound through phase 2 and aren't looking at it. So I think we got to solve for that.
Yeah, there's serious practical issues if you're actually trying to apply, for example, electronic case report forms at a distance in the way you're describing, which would be ideal. But you also have to meet all the requirements for good clinical practice, and you have to be able to withstand scrutiny when you submit the data.
Absolutely.
And you have to, at least the first few times, do something you've never done before. And doing something you've never done before versus the sure thing that you know how to do, is, that's a tough decision. So there are a lot of natural impediments to this, and including not just on the industry side, but on the regulatory side as well.
Joel?
Yeah, just one comment. I think there are technical barriers and other elements to talk about. I think there are some human barriers as well. And I'll bring this back to sort of my day job, I guess, is that privacy is a big issue as well. And we could probably spend the rest of the day talking about that. But I think one of the things that we found as we started to examine how to use some of these clinical trials, we actually spoke to our patient advocates, and there's some in the room that have advised us early on. And some of the things that they said to us is, "You mean you're not already doing this?" So they thought it was happening. And then when we said, well, there's intellectual property related issues, and we're all trying to figure out how to use these data, they're like, well, make it happen now. And so I think our advocates have been pushing us even faster than we can go, because we do need to address some of these technical issues. But I think that the human element here is big. I think in the cancer world in which we're working in this particular project, there's a strong willingness of patients to share their data. And they want, if my spouse, my husband, my daughter, brother, whatever else sacrificed for the clinical trial or for cancer, let's use those data again. And if you multiply that by the hundreds of thousands of patients that are out there, or even more that we could get, we can really give back.
Do you think there's a disconnect between the willingness of people to share and HIPAA or other privacy regulations that might be out there? Some friends of mine have said, HIPAA is preventing a lot of very important data-related research.
Yeah, and personally, I think that may be an unrealistic barrier, or something that people fall back on to say privacy-related issues or HIPAA-related issues restrict me. I think in a project like we're working on, or other data projects that are going on, there are ways to appropriately and statistically de-identify data so that there are 0.001% chance of any kind of re-identification. So we are employing these types of de-identification procedures, and Glen and I spoke about it as we started, is the technical aspects around de-identification are not that hard. You certify that, and there's no way that you can, there are ways, but there really is low probability that you're going to re-identify that patient.
Yeah. Well, now that you've opened the privacy door, why don't we walk through it? So, Richard, from a regulatory standpoint, how is this being approached now, and how do you see it going forward?
Well, first of all, I agree that often the so-called legal privacy concerns are overstated. Usually they are solvable. We've almost always found some way to deal with them. And obviously depersonalization or anonymization is the key. We have seen recently some demonstrations of remarkable ability to identify people on the basis of information about their location, their age, the particular, perhaps unusual condition they have, something about their genetic characteristics. There was a wonderful presentation that I saw up at the MRCT at Harvard about a year ago that really surprised me, frankly. They were identifying individuals and gave you their names and addresses and things like that. That's a little scary, but I assume that people who are smarter than I am will figure out how to get around that or resolve that problem. There's also obviously a data security issue. That is, if you're going to be moving enormous amounts of personal information around in large quantities, people have to have assurance that it's protected. So that's important as well. But by and large, we have been able to solve most of those problems here up to this point. In fact, more easily in the United States, by and large, than in Europe. We had an enormous debate about aspects of medical research for quite a while in Europe. We're pretty much over it now, because most people have realized you can't use the data privacy rules as a reason to stop having important public health research. But it took us about 10 years to work through it. So they're not trivial issues, but they're solvable.
So those are solvable. Well, what are the significant regulatory barriers then, in terms, if there are any, in terms of using big data to?
Oh, the big barrier, there are some technical legal barriers. There are some provisions of law that under U.S. law, efficacy is demonstrated only by 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical trials with exceptions and so forth. There are a handful of those, but they're remarkably few, actually. In fact, if you even look at the forms that we use to file applications for approval of products on both sides of the Atlantic, they have a place in which you can put these sorts of data, and they could satisfy the requirements if they were acceptable. So the main problem is the attitude of regulators as to whether they have confidence in new ways of using data and new ways of developing data that will support findings of safety and effectiveness and so forth. I'd like to analogize this to a huge debate that we had when I first started law practice in the 70s, which was whether the United States would ever accept clinical trial data from any place other than the United States. And the reason was ultimately we didn't trust them. And we didn't trust them because the systems were not in place to assure FDA that studies done outside the U.S. were reliable, that the data were honest, the patients were properly treated, and things like that. We got over it. It took about 20 years. It was a concerted effort, but we did. And by and large, we now more or less accept studies done in other countries. We're going to need to do a similar educational project for the use of non-traditional data sources, at least as a supplement for the traditional randomized clinical trial. And we're probably going to need a little kickstart from Congress, too, in the form of pilot programs that are mandated in the Prescription Drug User Fee Act renewal coming up in a couple of years or something like that.
So legislative action is one way. What are the other Jedi mind tricks that could be successful to make it a less than a 20-year journey?
I'm sure that Eric knows this better than I do, but FDA definitely responds not only to mandates from Congress, but funded mandates. You know, if you give them, not only tell them what to do, but you give them the money to do it, which means probably we, in the royal sense of the pharmaceutical industry, will probably end up paying for it if we want a pilot program. But there are things like that are possible, and FDA ultimately responds to what the Congress wants if the Congress gives them some money to do it.
Eric, thanks to add?
I think that's right. I mean, I'd take it a little bit different. I actually think we're running close to hitting the limit in some ways in what we can do with de-identified data compared to what we should be doing with identifiable data. We work in rare and undiagnosed diseases, and sometimes you simply can't de-identify these folks, or severe phenotypes. You've got that. I've worked in situations where we were doing translational research, and people are asking about, well, unfortunately I had this problem in my family, blah, blah, blah. I had this daughter, should I get pregnant again? Well, guess what? The DNA you gave me, that wasn't this kid's father. I can't contact them to tell them that, right? I don't know. I mean, this is just the realities of what happens in clinical practice when you get and you really hit this. So one of the things we're looking at, and with the Rare and Undiagnosed Disease Program, is we're actually looking to build the first completely identified data network for translational research, because someone has to do it, and you can make it secure, and you can do it. It's not going to be cheap or easy, but I think that's a step. The other thing that goes on, and you talk about precision medicine, is a lot of what goes on in these programs now is it's a cycle where a case almost gets referred back to basic science because you found something hereditary or very interesting in a family, right? We see a lot of pharma companies that are going into rare diseases to understand certain types of things and then go out. So you want to be able to go, so you actually want to be able to, so a step would be, can a basic researcher contact that family? Because a lot of folks, a lot of patients would say yes. If there's a really bright young scientist somewhere who's working on this rare disease that everyone tells me no one else has, how do you make that contact? So I think translationally and pushing the envelope a little bit, there's really valid scientific and medical reasons to push these ways.
Yeah, and that's obviously permissible if you have consent.
Right.
And the key thing is having consent. It's absolutely mandatory in Europe to have consent if the data are not depersonalized and you're sharing them beyond what was agreed by the person whose data were obtained. And the real-world problems of getting consent, I mean, if you're dealing with very small populations and so forth, the real-world problems are not that difficult. But I've been involved in cases where we had to re-consent after academic studies were done and we wanted the data for regulatory purposes in Europe. several years later, we had to go back and try to find people in a cancer trial. Of course, half of them were dead and things like that. It's pretty complicated. So there are ways of solving those problems, but the logistics should not be minimized. They're
Can
quite
I make a comment about acceleration too? I think, in the life sciences, as we look at health information, I think that seems to be a large challenge for people to, discuss. There may be employer-related issues and other things too, but let's think of the banking industry, for example. And our project team actually has a very interesting analogy where, you get off the plane in Bangkok and you're not at all shy about putting your ATM card in a mobile van to get, currency, right? So there's a lot in that little stripe that's floating around in zeros and ones all over the place. But if it happens to be a tumor, that is, may keep you from work. I think we're a little concerned about where those data go. But can we learn security-related issues from other industries that have kept it secure? Obviously, I don't want people knowing my bank account, right? But and some of my health information I'm willing to share. So, I think there are some ways to accelerate that by learning from others.
Yeah.
So last week, I was at the White House at a working group on healthcare big data. And one of the main topics was around privacy. The consensus from this group was that, for the most part, HIPAA is not the main impediment, that it does slow things down or can, but that wasn't really the issue. But there was also a feeling that we don't really have set up right now a system that balances the upside of what you can get from data and what patients actually want. Right? So as Eric said, only 3% of cancer patients in the U.S. participate in clinical trials. Now, if you have cancer or some life-threatening disease, how much do you really care about privacy? Maybe some, but I think right now there's a feeling that there isn't anything to keep the balance from tipping too much towards let's lock down the data, regardless of how much it prevents research from happening. At our company, we deal with a lot of anonymized, de-identified data. So we've been licensed roughly 100 million lives of data, claims data linked with labs and demographics and other things. And then from other partners, we do have identified data. And there are limitations. I mean, there are certainly questions that we try to answer within the computer models when we try to get down to specific predictions of what treatment for a given individual, where we are limited by the fact that certain information has been taken out. Because we do know there's a lot of demographic and consumer-related correlates that play big roles in determining how to intervene with a given individual for medication adherence or things like that. So, I think there's a balance, and I think what this group, what the pharma industry as a whole needs to make sure happens is that things are moving in the right direction in terms of greater access and being aware of the fact that you're talking about lives as well as a big opportunity when we go too far.
So can I ask Richard a question?
Sure. It's a conversation.
Because we have this consent process, which is very, it's focused on what you can do with data more than what you can't do. And I think a lot of these patients who probably are being consented in a study where you can't identify their data for subsequent use, where it could be linked to other things, are then the people who are going home and posting on Facebook that they just got an experimental therapy and their tumor is shrinking. And so I wonder if there's room in the current legal framework to allow companies to do more of a opt-out style of consent, where you are consenting for the full use of your data, very much the way you get catalogs in the mail and you have to opt out from getting them. You can always say, no, I have a particular condition that I've decided I don't want to share with people, but maybe we could kind of, as an industry, get our minds wrapped around being more.
Yeah, I don't think, actually, just envisioning the way the FDA regulations are written, I don't think that would be prohibited as long as it was absolutely transparent, clearly understood, and the patient wasn't being fooled in some way. It could not be like the opt-out boxes in little tiny type on the bottom of most websites and things like that. It'd have to be something a lot more sophisticated than that. It probably wouldn't work in Europe because there are separate consent requirements under the Data Protection Directive that are different from the informed consent requirements for clinical trials, and they expressly require the written explicit consent of a patient to the sharing or further use of sensitive information, and that means everything you collect in a clinical trial. So there would be some things you'd have to work on. Could I say something, though, about a point we've had a number of points in which people have described how very beneficial it would be for the development of new information from existing databases to have them all public or being shared. And clearly that's true. There's no question that if every research scientist in the world had access to all of the raw data of every other research scientist, presumably that they could use them in some way, it would benefit science. The problem we have to recognize, is very important to recognize this, is that the model we have built on the international stage for the protection of our intellectual property, which is ultimately the way in which we make the money to do the clinical trials, depends upon provisions that we've put into international agreements that protect the confidentiality of those data, okay? So before we tear down that system, we better think up an alternative to it, or we're going to find ourselves with no ability to make any return on investment in a large number of markets in the world, okay? So before we rush into let's tell everybody all our data, let's figure out what the alternative system of protecting our economic interests is, so we'll have some money to pay for the next clinical trial.
Now, Richard, I agree with you, but I think it's important to separate out data collected for research purposes, whether in an academic setting or a pharma company, from data exhaust that's generated every day when individuals interact with the healthcare system. Because in the first case, you're right, that's the fuel that funds the industry. In the second case, this data is just really being wasted.
Oh, I agree with you there. And there, the issue is the consent, if required, of the person whose information is stored, and compliance with requirements for privacy. There's not a debate there. I'm talking about the studies that industry funds for the purpose of demonstrating safety and effectiveness to get approval of drugs. And I'm not, in principle, opposed to the idea that that should all be in the public domain. But before we put it in the public domain, I would like to figure out an international consensus by which we will somehow have a reasonable period of time to recover our investment. Because if the data are all out in the world right now, we will have zero time to recover our investment.
Is that the model that you would tacitly propose, which is that there's a certain amount of time before the data?
Yeah, that's what I personally would, but I can't speak for any client or for pharma. It might be a long period, but it would be a period.
Yeah, another potential, another potential model for that might be to kind of reverse how I think people think about techniques and data in life sciences, and that the data is proprietary, but we all use the same techniques.
Sure.
And maybe what we should be working on protecting from an IP basis are the techniques, because the data is going to be available, almost like Jurassic Park. It will, inevitably escape. I can't remember who it originally came from, but I heard somebody talking about data is the new crude oil. And I don't think that's a great analogy, because crude oil is an inherently limited resource, and data is pretty much inherently unlimited. We can figure out whether from your mobile phone or your ATM card where in the world probably everybody in this room is. But as we get more sophisticated in terms of, I think, a life sciences company not just going to market with a compound, but a compound that has a solution around it that leads the patient to behave optimally, the physician to prescribe optimally, there's algorithms involved in the perfect delivery of that medication. Those algorithms, for lack of a better term, those techniques can be something that maybe are trade secrets and does give that life sciences company something protectable. Meanwhile, they're using all this data that is so abundant, and we don't have to protect that from other countries.
Well, number one, that'll be great if you're in a company that manages to produce a really valuable algorithm. It may be less valuable to you if you're a company that uses old-fashioned algorithms but spends a lot of money developing useful data to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of compounds.
Not an easy transition.
But probably the most important thing to recognize, and I'll not say this again, but the most important thing to recognize is we have a model in place that sort of protects us in 150-plus countries, and we should think very carefully before we begin saying and doing things that encourage people to dismantle that model, because in probably 130 of those 150 countries, people would like to dismantle it.
I totally agree with you.
Eric?
A couple things that I just heard that key. I mean, first and foremost, I think, the thing about consent that's interesting is that it also has to do with where you are in the healthcare continuum, right? Because for quality of care studies, they don't have to be consented, right? So most medical professional societies and health, it's almost their obligation to do this. So that's all identified data, what's working, what's not, how are we evolving our quality care guidelines for orthopedic surgery. This is what they do. So that's a really interesting body of knowledge that should make its way into a learning health system. The other piece, and I really agree with Rich said, especially about RCTs, is the other thing that flies into this, and I think becomes the wrong type of barrier, possibly for the wrong type of reasons, is what type of data is whom protecting. I think, the BRCA story right now with people fighting to get access to their data, and, is my gene the proprietary of company? That's not helping in a lot of ways for anybody, right? I mean, those types of things. I think it's really important that we understand, what is the provenance, who owns what is the right way to do it, who's incented in what part of the system, and that you're doing that. Because I think, in some ways, you just can't get consent right for all of that. In a practical sense.
Actually, we haven't discussed that yet, which is there's the famous case of Moore against the University of California Board of Regents, which was a sort of law school examination opinion in which every conceivable tort and contract theory was examined to determine whether developing something valuable using the tissue from a particular patient resulted in that patient having some ownership right in that material. And sure, it could also be from genetic material and so forth. That question is not really answered any place, as best I can tell. And I'm not sure that there's anybody who's really trying to answer it, because nobody knows what the right answer is. But it is potentially an important question, and it's one that we're probably going to have to think about at some point. But we've been largely sort of pretending it doesn't exist.
It'll be litigated or legislated, right?
Well, in the U.S., eventually almost everything is litigated, so that's probably true.
So says the person who litigates.
Michael, let me ask a question actually back to you and to the panel too, and maybe this can be opened up once we open it up to the crowd. I think a lot of times, and this is absolutely the path we took in Project Datasphere, is that we had a lot of discussion about what we couldn't do, right? And so and then we flipped it around and said, what could happen if we could do this? So I would ask my colleagues, are there examples out there? And we have one, right? So we have one where we've de-identified appropriately, we put it up in a broad source, open source platform. What we need are examples which are being generated right now. But for the rest of my colleagues, is it happening in places where it's secure, it's private, there are no or little IP risk?
Or in other countries, as Richard opened the door to as well.
And it has to be medical context.
It doesn't have to be, because this is where I think we can learn from.
So the not medical, but certainly health related in a consumer perspective, if it didn't get people to exercise more, buy more athletic gear and use it every day, Nike and Withings and Fitbit would not be investing in the devices and the social software that they're investing in. So, the athletic industry, for lack of a better term, has clearly figured out that data sharing is a great way to get people to behave differently in a way that's economically advantageous to that industry. So, I think it's a potentially good parallel for how we should think about driving patient behaviors or consumer behaviors before they become patients.
No, it's interesting, and maybe that's a trial recruiting effort as well, right? So you could, if I'm going to buy Nikes, or if they're going to know where I am at all times, perhaps if we know where cancer patients are, we can market to them.
Sure.
And Joel, just to clarify the question, you're asking, are there examples of where data sharing is going on, or where it's been successful, or where it's been less limited than what you guys are doing?
Yeah, and that's true. And I think what we had a challenge with is, we had a room full of pharmaceutical lawyers who basically said no.
Not that there's anything wrong with it.
No, I mean,
I'm used to it.
No, and that's fine. And that was actually, we kept asking the question, and we needed to hear no, but we needed to tell them why yes. And so what I'm asking is, how do we get past some of the litigation or legislation-related mandates, or how do we get by and past some of the security and privacy-related things with tools that we have, or other examples that may not be coming from healthcare?
Right. One example I can share with you is an effort called Orion Bionetworks. This was funded initially by Johnson & Johnson. It involves Patients Like Me, the first social networking medical company, our company doing the machine learning modeling, Accelerated Cures Project, which is a patient foundation, and then Harvard Med School, Brigham and Women's, and this is focused on multiple sclerosis. Yep. So this was an interesting effort of where data was coming from a number of different institutions. This is patient data, so electronic medical records, derived data, as well as genetics and genomics, and this got done. It did take a while to figure everything out, but the data was put into a secure place, and where multiple users had varying levels of access to it, including the results. And what was interesting about that consortium was the agreement in terms of what happens to the IP, because you have a lot of now interesting discoveries coming out. Who owns it? Part of the mandate of this group was to essentially create a different pre-competitive threshold in the industry, and this was built upon a consortium, a semiconductor consortium in Europe, where essentially the partners who put up the money would get access to the discoveries and the models for essentially a year or year and a half, and then it would end up going out to the whole world. So that's one example.
That's great. Yeah.
I believe I'm certainly not an expert around what they're doing, but I believe the National Health Service in the UK is opening up their clinical trial data sets across UK patients, I think in an effort to get more people to do studies in the UK, because they think that's economically beneficial. But I believe that may be an example of somebody who's trying to proactively open data sets.
Well, I don't know. Obviously, almost every clinical trial done in the UK is done within the NHS,
Right.
but hardly any are sponsored by the NHS, most of them, and hardly any are sponsored by government either. And this may be completely off the wall, but you might want to look at the legal lessons of credit rating.
Yeah.
We all just assume and take for granted that some big brother someplace knows every time we were made a late payment, and every time we failed to pay something, and every time we used a credit card beyond its limit or something like that, and they use that with a formula to decide things that are fundamental to our lives, and I can't remember ever giving anybody permission to do that. So you might want to find out exactly. You must be, but you might want to find out how they got away with it, because they can do it in Europe too. So
That's a good point.
As a management consultant, I love seeing, examples from other industries. Now, there's clearly things that are very important about this industry, but being able to see examples from other industries and what's the analogous lesson to be brought to bear in biopharma, I think that's very powerful. Colin, let me pick up on another thread that you had mentioned, right? When you had two categories of data, the category of data that comes out of clinical, and then all the stuff that happens afterwards. Some people called it real-world evidence, exhaust data or data exhaust, as you had suggested. What do you see as the potential for that data, as opposed to the pure RCT-type data, going forward in terms of really creating value for doing good in terms of health outcomes?
Right. I think the potential for the real-world data or data exhaust is huge. I think it's actually a lot bigger than clinical trial data. So I hope I'm not offending anyone. But why I think the potential is bigger is that it's a lot faster, it's a lot cheaper, it's going to grow in diversity much faster. And I actually think the potential for the use of that data in this healthcare system in the US, where we spend $2.7 trillion a year, I actually think there's the potential in there to reduce that by a very significant amount, meaning on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars, as much as Obamacare promises to impact the cost. And the reason is because we have these blind spots in terms of knowing what treatment works for which individual, whether drugs or other things. And drugs, I think, are held to the highest standard of evidence in terms of efficacy. But think about it. Disease by disease, the percent of patient response for any given FDA-approved drug that's fully reimbursed by insurance companies and other payers is, in asthma drugs, 40%, 50%, arthritis, 50%, cancer drugs don't work. Any particular cancer drug works in only 25% of patients on average. So what's wrong with this picture? If this is better than any other healthcare intervention, right, medical device, doctor's visits, disease management programs, operations, then we have this issue where we're wasting huge amounts of money, time, and lives because people aren't getting the right treatment. And so when my father was diagnosed with prostate cancer, he's given standard of care for a hypothetical average patient as opposed to information that's specific about him being taken into account. And he's 69 years old, African American with Caribbean roots, blah, 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 family history of whatever. We even had Foundation Medicine sequence his tumor biopsy. Now, one doesn't have to get all the way to genomics to make this work. You can do this with general EMR data, claims data, and do a much better job than we do today. To me, that's the biggest opportunity across the healthcare system, is now leveraging this data with decades of Moore's Law and very advanced machine learning algorithms, especially if they're Bayesian. Right?
Thank you.
And this is not just a pipe dream anymore because the data assets exist from third-party data aggregators. It's not pretty data, but it's good enough to get started, and we know that this is going to have huge impact. This, in some ways, comes under the beyond that pill stump speech that most biopharma CEOs are giving, which is, well, how do you get more out of your drug? 3 weeks ago, I gave a talk in San Diego to a bunch of pharma PBM, pharma market access people on behalf of a PBM, and I started with the question of, drugs in this country account for 12% of the healthcare spend at $300 billion. Is that a good deal? Is that an exact right deal, or is it a bad deal? The overwhelming consensus was that drugs are actually cheap relative to the $300 billion they cost, that they provide more healthcare value than 12%. I think that's true, but I think that is where going beyond the pill and now using very advanced data-driven algorithms from data that's just coming off of the system every day, I think is going to have the biggest impact, not just in healthcare, but I think in pharma. And I think pharma has a special role to play in healthcare because drugs are not being properly leveraged as much as they can be.
Please get ready with your questions. I'll just follow this thread. Do other members of the panel agree that this type of data has potentially even greater potential than from clinical trials? And if so, why isn't more being used?
Well, so I completely agree with Colin. And maybe it sounds ironic coming from a guy who makes his living trying to aggregate clinical trial data, but I think the non-clinical trial data is incredibly valuable and in many ways more valuable than what does come out of the clinical trials. The not caveat, but the thing that I think we have to recognize is that human physiology is extremely complicated, and we've got a couple more decades of Moore's Law before we can decide whether or not a molecule is going to work or not based entirely on simulation, right? So at some point, you are going to need to give something to a patient, and so maybe it's not going to be randomized, and maybe it's not going to be controlled, but there is going to be a trial. And I think the big challenge that we've got, and I think Richard identified it as well, is how do we come up with acceptable regulatory criteria by which we can match data about the first patients who are exposed to a new molecule or a new therapy, whatever combination of molecules and device it is, to that real world data. And I'll just give try to give a real world example. We're doing a lot of clinical trials in the world today that use walk tests as endpoints. And I would argue that if we gave all those patients a Fitbit instead, we would have a much, much better control set, in everybody else in the world who's wearing a Fitbit. Right. And so, yeah, I completely, applaud the idea.
I just want to also clarify, though, I'm not against clinical trials. That's
not opposition.
We are both Bayesians.
We're both Bayesians, and we happen to make most of our money still from the clinical trial side. But I think the real-world data has a huge opportunity to supplement that knowledge and to accelerate it. And the ability to essentially conduct virtual trials from a learning healthcare system is the big opportunity.
And I just point out something that's a little bit of an irony, which is that one of the earliest uses of these data is to maximize the likelihood of success in a clinical trial by choosing the population and slicing and dicing it in such a way as to maximize the chance of demonstrating effectiveness, which of course is the name of the game. But the real question is what's going to happen when you go out in the real world, and is the drug going to work with the level of efficacy that you were able to find in a very carefully controlled trial. But it's funny to me, we'll then use big data to examine that question, having used big data to design a trial. that was designed, to show efficacy in a specific set of patients with a specific type of control.
Turtles all the way down. Eric, you'll have the last word, and then we invite questions at the end.
I think the last thing to add to that, I think about the real-world evidence is the velocity piece of it. I think there's a couple things. If you look at the way our regulatory system is structured today, it used to be that if a bad drug got it would take a real long time to know it. So what is now, you know it very quickly. I'm not advocating for dropping standards. I'm just saying the world has changed in a way where you would know much more quickly of something. So that's an important thing to think about. The other thing about velocity is no one is controlling the conversation about products that they manufacture anymore. Anyone who thinks they are isn't, because there's just too many forms and too many ways that conversation is happening, and you can't be a part of them all. And that's an opportunity and it's a threat, but it's an important aspect of data in this space.
Michael, let me just add one more thing here too. So that was supposed to be the last word, but I have
No
a
one's
few
at the
more.
microphone, so you have it.
Okay, I think this is where we start, right? So this is the starting point. This is the place where we've collected data in a relatively standardized fashion, and it's a way to place it in an environment where you can analyze it. The first question that was asked of Project DataSphere was, actually maybe it was the second. First question was, can you put genomics in here, right? So adds a little bit more complexity and perhaps privacy-related issues. Second question was, can you put claims data in here? But, I think the way that we see the project now is if we're starting in cancer, and that's where we think the project will be valuable, because if we can accelerate cancer clinical trials, we're going somewhere. But at the same time, if you overlay on the top of those seemingly false environments in a clinical trial, right, selective populations, et cetera, and you lay over the top of that the real world information to see, are you actually is your efficacy matching up to the real world? I heard some very interesting comments made at the NCCN meeting over the last couple of weeks, is that some payers are making decisions on their formularies based on their claims data because the real world outcomes were less than what was seen in the clinical trials. I'm a little afraid of that, actually, because that, yes, it is a selected population, but what kind of data are you using to make a clinical care selection, right? So that's why it's randomized, it's controlled, et cetera. So, the claims environment is not randomized and very well controlled because of formularies and pathways and other things too. So I think there's a great opportunity to overlay clinical trial, collected in a standardized fashion with relatively loose data in a claim setting to see where they fit together.
Right. Questions?
Paul Howard, Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. I had asked Colin this question a little bit earlier, so I'll ask it to the panel. So it does appear that in some sense the conversation is way behind where consumers are at. We had a guest speaker this morning who got cancer and started a blog about it. Patients like me, 23andMe, other places, patients are willingly going to aggregate their data. People are paying money to Evernote and other applications to manage data, collect data for them. And also in this new environment, final thought, people are facing thousands of dollars for exchange plan deductibles. The employer market's moving in that direction, I think, too. Consumers are just going to be bearing more costs going forward. Isn't there just an appetite for the management of health information for consumers, not just through Fitbit and other tools, that will, A, help us keep ourselves healthier so we don't have to hit those big copays or have those big out-of-pocket costs, and if we do have those serious health events, help us navigate the system and get the best outcomes?
So I think the answer to that question is a resounding yes, but I think it's also interesting to look at places where that hasn't worked. And so I actually am kind of fascinated by the fact that Google's attempt at a personal health record got canceled. And if you look at what Microsoft Health Vault originally was, at least as I understood it, talked about as, has changed significantly. And there doesn't actually seem to be a consumer appetite for dealing with the broad set of data around you as an individual until there's a compelling reason to look at it in a more specific way. As soon as somebody is diagnosed with something, then they're really interested in seeing that data, being part of a benchmark, comparing themselves. As soon as somebody wants to run a faster 10K, they're really interested in sharing their running data. So I think there is something that we're missing about how to connect with people in terms of managing their overall health, and we got to figure out how to instrument people in a way that's compelling to them. And I think, just too much data is overwhelming. What is the foursquare of personal health? And I'm not sure if we figured that out yet.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. I think there is a substantial element of willingness, but also this is an informed population sitting in this room, right? So, I think all of us are very interested to see, perhaps the diagnostic tool that's going to tell me what the next 20 years of my life is going to look like. But, the uninformed population who feels overwhelmed by the amount of data that's being collected from their mobile phone or wherever else, I think there needs to be some demonstration stories that say that this is good, as opposed to this is scary.
Please.
Thanks, Michael. Martin Murphy from the CEO Roundtable on Cancer. I'd just like to salute you, Michael, and the whole panel, and whoever else put this together and selected all of you, because this has been a very informative and engaging couple of hours. I'd encourage pharma to maintain this format and this kind of paneling. And then for an unabashed, free commercial, I'd like to, first of all, thank Joel, who has worked so hard and his colleagues on Project Datasphere, and encourage everyone here to go on to and into the sphere by just going into www.projectdatasphere.org. And it is entirely free. The SAS analytics are, of course, not open source, they're proprietary, but through the generosity of SAS, Jim Goodnight in particular, they've made all of those analytics free of any charge for anybody for as long as you're in the sphere. And the other thing about it, Eric, and this probably is a reflection of your years at the FDA, the FDA is really encouraging Project Datasphere, and believe us, whenever the FDA encourages, you usually listen. Doesn't mean you always do it, but you listen. In this case, we're doing it, is to really seek out, quote, rare cancers,
Yes.
be they pediatric or adult,
Yeah.
in the hopes of being able to get a strong enough global database for the agency to look at, validate, and say, we may be able to reduce, or who knows, the belief, the dream would be to eliminate the comparator arm, lower the bar, therefore, for sponsors and so forth, and be able to really approach rare cancers much more readily. So there's a resonance, at least in the oncology area, thank you, Eric, for big data and for enterprises like Project Datasphere. And if anyone here is of a company that has data or knows someone who does, this is where an opportunity exists to actually provide it. There's been tremendous contributions, and let me salute the legal establishment. If it were not for Hogan Lovells and their hundreds of hours of pro bono support, Joel, we'd never be here. If it weren't for Jim Goodnight and SAS and all those analytics, we wouldn't have this now 48-year-old child. It was only born Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. And finally, if we didn't have the pharmaceutical industry who originally took the courage and said, we're going to de-identify comparator arm phase 3 high-quality data, and we're going to freely put it into this sphere that's totally porous in the sense that it welcomes you. That's what my job is, to welcome you. Welcome to Project Datasphere. We would not be here. So those three legs not only provided a stool, they provided a launch pad upon which now it's an invitation to all of you to take it wherever it can go. Thanks for that opportunity, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Other questions? Otherwise, we'll head to the lightning round.
Mike Levy from Pharma. First of all, thank you very much, all of you, for the very engaging discussion and very interesting discussion. There was some talk about virtualizing clinical trials, and there was some talk about pilots. And I think that, as Glen said, I think we're far from virtualizing complete trials. We're probably decades away. However, we might be much closer to virtualizing pieces of trials. And what would it take for us to, for example, remove the placebo arm from a trial, replace it with a model? And could that be a pilot? Would that be something that could be pilotable, in your opinion? So I would love to hear what the technical and regulatory barriers to doing so.
Yeah, let me start. This is certainly a dream and a vision. Of course, some other options that we've considered too is that, you know, if you enter into the comparator arm of a particular clinical trial and you trend towards the negative, can you move more quickly, right? So these adaptive trial designs that are out there now, can we do that with the data we already have? Right now, we are starting a prostate cancer challenge with multiple clinical trials, comparator arms of prostate cancer in Project Datasphere to examine the epidemiology of the patients that have been in clinical trials and comparing all of the, you know, the standards of care that have been used in them so that we can design that next trial in a much better way. I think I would like to hear from my legal colleagues and my FDA experts as well, because some of the pushback that we've received about elimination is a bit of a challenge. So, you know, regulatorily and legally, can you actually do that? But, you know, that's a dream, that's a vision, and even if we can, like I said, you can save a considerable amount of money and time if we reduce even just 5 to 10%.
It's one of those rare legal questions where the answer is simple. It is permitted. It's expressly permitted by the regulations. In fact, what we were just describing, which is trying to develop a body of data such as the CEO's Roundtable is doing to serve as the historical control. Historical controls are expressly permitted under the regulation that defines what's an adequate and well-controlled clinical trial. So there's no issue there at all. Another interesting point, though, is outside the United States, there's a general consensus that a placebo-controlled trial presents significant ethical considerations, that it should only be done as an absolute last resort because of the fact that you have an untreated arm in the study. We're the one country in the world that still holds up the placebo-controlled trial as the gold standard.
Yeah, and sorry, Eric, let me just jump in here 1 second. I had a conversation Wednesday of this week with a 17-year myeloma survivor who's been on therapy for 13 of those 17 years. He and his wife were having a conversation in front of some of my other colleagues, and I really had to explain the clinical trial process, and this is in, you know, multiple myeloma, that we don't have in cancer. In most diseases, we generally do not have placebo-controlled clinical trials. There's a bit of education to do, right, but perhaps, you know, as a demonstration that, you know, is there a way to, in addition to not only not having placebo controls, to not have that arm at all? I mean, that would be a great vision. I don't think we're quite there yet, but that's the direction we're headed.
A couple of points on the house. One is disease area really matters, right? You've got some diseases like neurodepression where your your placebo effect is the same as your you can't tease it out, right? So that's a really important point in there. The other thing I can tell you, the best day ever as someone who's done drug discovery and development is when your team gets pulled together with no scheduling, and you're told that your drug works so well that the board found it unethical to continue to give placebo and everybody's getting drug. That's a really good day as a drug developer, and it was usually oncology, of course, right? So I think, yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things I can say, and probably, I mean, a couple of things. One, for the gentleman on the FDA on cancer, we want to really make sure that Dr. Woodcock and Dr. Padser get credit, because again, it's very, very disease specific how things progress relative to these different areas. They're all very different. Not just the desks at the agency are different. It's a reflection of how different some of the diseases are. But I think understanding that where we've made progress there is that a lot of the things we pilot work. And, you know, the one thing I'll say is maybe as a challenge to consider myself an FDA alumni is when we get pilots to work, and when it's worked several times, we have to seriously consider how can we take it forward. Because sometimes there's a big gap and some very successful pilots don't flower. They don't go to that next step, even after you've got an N of 5 or 10. So I think some of this is political, some of this is legislative. I know it's complex, but when the experiment and the data are adding up, I think we do have to try to help act and to move the bar progress forward.
To that point, the placebo data, whether it's new or pre-existing, is not the only thing that can be shared in a clinical trial. And if you look at the success of I-SPY 2, or the NCI is starting up a lung cancer platform trial now, industry collaboration on designing an adaptive study where you are preferentially assigning patients based on biomarkers and where you see, in a Bayesian way, efficacy and safety, I think is another way that we can we don't have to boil the whole ocean and make this all work at once. We can get a lot more value out of the patients who are volunteering today by thinking in other collaborative ways. So topic for probably a whole nother session.
Terrific. And just to give credit where credit's due, in fact, Mike and the pharma staff put together this terrific panel, so thank you. There was another question coming?
Hi, Jeff Blows, Astellas Medical. You know, we, in the beginning, talked about the funny name big data. And I think one of the reasons we use that term is because what we're talking about is something that we villainized for the past 3 decades, and that's retrospective data. And, you know, our academic colleagues and even those of us in the medical community and pharma have preached how that data is at best hypothesis generating, and you can't prove anything with retrospective data. I don't believe that's true. I believe that we have methodologies now to get around the biases of retrospective data reviews, but I think we have a lot of distance to travel to change that culture that anything other than a controlled clinical trial is truly valid data.
Great, thank you. And now for the quick lightning round. We'll start at Eric and answer quickly. What are you most excited about with respect to big data and biopharma?
The data sharing, sorry.
Data sharing.
I do think the data clubs, yeah.
Richard.
I'm most excited about the possibility of convincing FDA to be more flexible in the use of this data.
Colin.
Curing cancer and other diseases by actually getting to the right targets and showing who they actually work for in the real world.
Glen.
Driving a mechanism of action versus a indication or organ-specific view of the world.
Joel.
I would say giving back to those patients that have given their data already.
What concerns you most with respect to big data and biopharma? Glen, we'll go this way.
Going this way?
Yeah. Sorry, Joel.
Probably the privacy issues.
Yeah.
Losing signal for really interesting things that are happening in tiny populations that presumably we're trying to serve, but maybe underserved by some of the strategies we've been discussing.
Colin.
A culture that moves too slowly.
Really the same, which is it's going to take us a long time to change the attitudes of the regulators.
Sorting between reasons and excuses.
If you were a biopharma company and you had to invest in only one thing to create value using big data, what would it be?
Patient engagement.
It would be, in my view, policy development to try to convince the authorities to use the data more extensively.
Applications of machine learning to comparative effectiveness.
I'm with Eric, patient engagement.
Acceptance of these data as being real.
If you could suggest only one thing for regulators to do, what would it be?
Listen to us.
Do a better job of pushing down what's at the top of the organization into the people who are actually reviewing applications.
Finding ways to expedite approvals.
Taking these new sources of data seriously.
Do less, think more.
And what has surprised you most about big data and biopharma? Eric.
That they're starting to get it.
That we're not doing as much as one would expect at this stage.
That it's taken this long, but that it actually is starting to take hold.
Yeah, that we're not applying it to the data sources we already have.
Joel, last word.
Yeah, I think the excitement of that we're on the logarithmic curve is using it even more.
Terrific. Please thank our panel.